Today, we're going to talk with Professor Douglas Berman about the future of capital punishment and answer the question of why don't we just dust off old Sparky? Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Todd Book. I'm the Director of Policy and Government Affairs here at the Ohio State Bar Association. And we have with us today Douglas Berman, professor from the Moritz College of Law at the Ohio State University. And Professor, let's talk about capital punishment.
All righty.
In Ohio, we still use capital punishment. As many of our viewers will know, that the use of the particular drug that will cause the death of the individual is in short supply. Many of the providers do not want to give that. That's right. Because of the fear that they'll be associated with, instead of helping people, they'll be associated with killing people. Some states have tried their own home brews, in essence. Where are we at right now? What's the status of capital punishment in Ohio and maybe in general across the state?
Right, at least with respect to execution protocols, Ohio has basically hit the pause button. And what's been interesting is that pause button was prompted at first by an ugly execution that went through involving Dennis McQuire at the start of 2014, where we tried a different set of combination of drugs that his lawyers said were going to cause problems. They did end up causing problems, though exactly the reason for the problems remains unclear. Governor Kasich at that point said, until we can have some more clarity on that, I'm going to postpone all the executions for 2014. Part of that was a story. There was lots of ongoing litigation, and that made it, I think, a good decision at the time, especially with an election year amidst 2014. But then as we got to 2015, it was clear we hadn't sort of figured out how to get access to the drugs, and we were struggling to still do that. He delayed all executions for 2015. Same story happened in 2016, and I think we're getting to a point where some decisions are going to have to be made, where we're going to have to figure out, can we get access to any of the drugs, or maybe start approaching a completely different way to carry out executions.
Because I know at the end of last session, they passed a bill that would in essence given the drug makers anonymity, so you wouldn't know who provided the drug, but that still doesn't seem to have helped anything.
Yeah, well, the first cut solution that a number of states tried out was, let's turn to compounding pharmacies, so we can't get these drugs that we need to carry out executions directly from the suppliers. But there are these things called compounding pharmacies that will combine drugs certain ways or can get access to the ingredients and help produce drugs that you might need in some special circumstances. And so that's what a number of states have turned to try to get access to these drugs. And one of the concerns that led to this legislation in Ohio was it's hard to get a pharmacy to do that if it's widely known that they're doing this. And so the thought was, if we provide some anonymity for that, then the compounding pharmacies would be more willing to put this together. But there have been troubles, even in states that have similar laws, in getting the drugs together and having compounding pharmacies that are willing to do this work. Even if they're kept secret, they think their names will come out. There's not a lot of money to make.
There's no secrets in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And so you put all those stories together. That's part of why that solution really hasn't worked sufficiently to get Ohio's execution chamber up and running again. There's also been efforts in other states, I think to some degree in Ohio, to reach out to those states that still have access to these drugs to see if you can get that, because I think Texas is still carrying out a couple executions a month. So some states are able to get the drugs they need to do lethal injections, but Ohio seems to be really stuck and really struggling to sort that out.
Well, for years we had other methods of inflicting capital punishment on an individual. Why don't we just dust off old Sparky and start it up again?
More than a few states have moved towards that as a backup, right, and have formally provided under their state law, if we don't have access to the execution drugs, let's do electrocution. A number of other states have actually talked about nitrogen gas and some other forms of execution. The reality is the instinct remains that it's constitutional, and the Supreme Court has now twice blessed the traditional lethal injection protocols. And the belief is, if we try another method, especially the electric chair, that's never been formally blessed constitutionally at the Supreme Court level. It's been suggested it's okay, but that was without sort of modern medical evidence. And so the concern is, if we can get the drugs, we can avoid the legal problems, but we have that practical problem. If we try other methods, we may have new legal problems, and that may be such a hornet's nest. Let's just keep trying to get the drugs. But I do think, especially given that we've now gone more than 2 years without an execution, literally scheduled execution dates, I think, are backed up all the way to 2019 at this point already. At some point, and candidly, I'll say when Governor Kasich gets off the campaign trail, my guess will be he'll come back to the state and recognize that this is an issue that he's going to have to take ownership of and start becoming a little bit more aggressive at sorting out those options.
Because I think as a state, we actually took the electric chair off the table, in essence. It's
Right.
no longer allowed by the code, correct?
Yeah. And I'll give Ohio's folks significant credit for being fairly nimble. We were the first state to go from a 3-drug protocol that required 3 drugs to being willing to try a single drug, and in fact that's become something of the gold standard, except we can't get that single drug that we need for an easy execution. Pentobarbital was the one that was being used there, and so Ohio, I think, it hasn't been a lack of a will to try to make this work. It's been the challenge of finding the way, and part of that story is Ohio has had some very capable defense attorneys as well, and a federal court that is really supervising this with a scrutinous eye, as it were, right? We've seen in other states that as you sort of unpack what states are really up to, you find some kind of ugly stories. The most notable recently, Oklahoma looked like it was getting back into the execution business, and then they showed up literally at the execution with the wrongly labeled drugs, right? And so there have been all these stories nationwide of other states messing up, and that I think has also contributed to the concern that if we're going to do this in Ohio, we got to make extra sure we get it right. That prompted Governor Kasich to say, let's keep waiting until we can be confident we're going to do this right. But a point is coming where we're going to have to make a decision.
It's obviously coming to a head. If we want to continue executions in Ohio, we're going to either find the drug somewhere, or move to another method.
Right.
And tell us, kind of a last thought here, what do you see as the future of executions in Ohio? Will we, if we can't find the drug, what do we move to? What's next?
I think nitrogen gas is being talked about as a potentially painless method. The problem is, do we want to try to be the first mover there, or do we think about going back to the electric chair, which at least has some social and a little bit of constitutional history, but again, the only thing we can be sure of is whatever other alternative is tried, there will be robust litigation, and especially these days, both at the state Supreme Court level and the U.S. Supreme Court level, there's so much discussion about perhaps broad constitutional challenges to the death penalty that I think that's another kind of litigation that the state would like to avoid if at all possible. So my guess is there's going to be continued efforts to try to get access to these drugs in some way, and if that's unavailable, some really hard choices confront.
Continued litigation from a lawyer's perspective is not necessarily a bad thing.
Well, that's certainly true. In fact, I got former students who are working on both sides, so that is the nature of this business. And again, it's not illegitimate. I often say when I teach about the death penalty, if you're going to do it right. Doing it right here has proven so practically challenging that it's perhaps not surprising that we're in this sort of pause period. But in some sense, as everybody knows, justice delayed becomes justice denied. And so I do think probably after this election cycle, it's going to be a critical moment for both the General Assembly and the governor to deal with this proactively.
Well, Professor Berman, thank you for coming in and talking about this very important subject. Hopefully you gleaned some information on this talk about lethal injection and the death penalty in Ohio, and hope to see you again soon with other topics.